Ben had been traveling for weeks. His ship had broken down again, and now he was stuck on the outskirts of the human colony. The planet was small, with barely any resources. It was the kind of place where people barely survived, scraping by on what they could find. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of food mixed with the sour scent of sweat. The marketplace was just a few dirty streets away from where his ship was parked. Ben didn't mind the quiet. He liked to keep to himself. The only thing that mattered to him was getting his ship fixed and moving on. He didn't want any trouble, just to get away from this broken place as soon as possible. But as he walked through the crowded streets, he saw something that made him stop. In the corner of the market, there was a girl. She was small, with pale green skin and big dark eyes. She looked out of place, as if she didn't belong here. Her clothes were torn and stained. She stood with a sign in her hands, offering herself for food. Her eyes were empty, like she had lost hope. Ben felt something twist in his chest. The girl looked so young, and yet she was standing there, waiting for someone to take advantage of her. His mind screamed at him to ignore her, to just keep walking, but his feet refused to move. Instead, he found himself walking towards her. When he got closer, the girl didn't look up. She didn't even seem to notice him. She just stared at the ground, holding the sign tightly. "Hey," Ben said softly, trying to get her attention. The girl's head jerked up and her eyes locked onto his. There was a moment of silence, a brief connection. Ben saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen in the faces of others on this planet. It was a fear that came from hunger, from desperation. She was hungry, tired, and broken. I don't need much," she said, her voice shaky. "Just some food, please." Ben's heart softened. He didn't know what made him do it, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small amount of credits. "How much for the food?" he asked. The girl blinked in surprise. You'll buy food for me?" Ben nodded. "I don't want you to have to do this. Just take the money and buy yourself something." She stared at the credits in his hand, as if she couldn't believe it was real. For a moment, she seemed too scared to take them. But then she grabbed them quickly, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, but Ben could hear the relief in it. Ben watched as she ran to the food stand nearby, leaving him standing there unsure of what had just happened. He had helped her, but it didn't feel like enough. There was something about her that made him want to do more. Maybe it was the sadness in her eyes, or the way she had looked at him like he was her last hope. He shook his head, telling himself not to get too involved. He didn't have the time or the energy for it. He was just passing through and he needed to focus on getting his ship fixed. But as he walked away, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. The girl was sitting at a table, eating quickly, her hands trembling as she tried to devour the food as fast as possible. Ben stopped walking. He wasn't sure why, but something in him told him to go back. Maybe it was just to make sure she didn't go back to that awful sign. Maybe it was because he had seen too many people like her, left to fend for themselves in places like this. Turning around, he made his way back to the food stand. The girl was still eating, but this time, her eyes were focused on the food. She didn't notice him approaching until he was standing right beside her. "Are you okay?" Ben asked, his voice softer than before. She looked up at him, surprised. Then she nodded quickly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice didn't sound fine. It sounded empty. Ben sat down across from her. "You don't have to go back to that stall," he said. "It's not right what you're doing." She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I don't have any other choice. There's nothing left for me here. My people are gone. I just need to survive." Ben felt a wave of sympathy for her. "I understand, but you don't have to do this alone." For the first time, the girl's face softened, and she looked at him with a bit of hope in her eyes. I don't know if anyone would help me, she said quietly. Ben thought for a moment. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was just a traveler who wanted to get out of this place as quickly as possible. But looking at her, sitting there so small and fragile, something inside him changed. "I'll help you," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how, but I'll help you." She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. But then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm Lyra," she said, her voice quieter now. "Thank you for helping me." Ben smiled slightly. "Ben, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll do what I can." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the marketplace surrounding them. The air was thick, but in that small moment, everything felt still. Ben didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know why he had made that decision to help her, but something told him it wasn't just a chance encounter. There was more to Lyra's story, and Ben felt a strange pull to be a part of it. As the sun began to set over the dusty streets of the colony, Ben made a promise to himself. He would not let her face this world alone. The next few days passed quickly, as Ben and Lyra found themselves trying to figure out how to survive in a place that didn't care much about people like them. Ben knew he didn't have many resources, but he also didn't have the heart to leave her behind. There was something about Lyra, something that made him feel protective of her, though he didn't quite understand why. Lyra, in turn, had been quiet. She didn't talk much about her past, and Ben didn't push her to. He could tell there was pain in her eyes, a deep, quiet sadness that she wore like an invisible cloak. She didn't seem to want to show any weakness, and Ben respected that. He wasn't the kind of person to ask too many questions, but he was there, offering what little he could to make things easier for her. They spent the days wandering the dusty streets, searching for odd jobs or any opportunity to earn a bit of food. The colony was a harsh place, full of broken-down ships and stranded travelers, people who had given up on the idea of a better life. It was hard to make a living here, but somehow Ben managed to pull together enough credits to buy them both a little food every day. One afternoon, while they were sitting under the shadow of an old shipping crate, Lyra finally spoke up. "I never thought anyone would help me like this," she said, her voice soft but steady. She was looking out over the crowded street, watching as people walked by without a second glance at her. Ben wasn't sure what to say. He didn't have a great explanation. "You don't deserve to be treated like that," he said, his voice low. "No one should have to live like that. No one." Lyra nodded, but she didn't look at him. Her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her ragged sleeve. "You don't know what I've been through, Ben. You don't know what people like me go through. Sometimes it feels like there's no way out." Ben wanted to say something comforting, but the truth was he didn't know what it was like. He had his own struggles, but he couldn't imagine the kind of life Lyra had led. Instead, he just sat there beside her, silent. He wasn't going to push her to open up if she wasn't ready. He had learned the hard way that some things had to come out on their own time. After a few minutes of silence, Lyra turned toward him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have said that." Ben shook his head. "Don't apologize. It's okay." He paused for a moment, unsure of how to continue. "We're in this together now, right? Whatever happens, we figure it out." She smiled slightly, and for the first time, it wasn't the smile of someone just trying to survive. It was a real smile, the kind that Ben hadn't seen from her before. It was small, but it meant something. Maybe there was hope for her yet. Maybe she just needed someone to show her that she didn't have to go through everything alone. Over the next few days, they found a small, run-down place to stay. It wasn't much, Just a tiny room in a building that smelled of damp wood and old metal, but it was a roof over their heads, and it was safe. Ben made sure to keep his head low, always cautious. He didn't know what kind of trouble could find them here, but he wasn't going to risk it. He'd been here before, stuck in places like this, with no way out. But this time was different. There was Lyra now, and he didn't want to let her down. He felt like he had made a promise to her, though he hadn't said it out loud. He would make sure she had a better life than this. One evening, as they sat in their small room, sharing a meager dinner, Ben turned to Lyra. "How did you end up here?" he asked gently. He had tried to avoid asking this question, knowing it might hurt her. But now he couldn't help it. He needed to understand. Lyra's eyes lowered, and for a moment, she was silent. Ben didn't rush her. He just waited. Finally, she spoke. "I'm from a planet far away," she said, her voice quiet. "My people, we were traders, explorers. But when the war came, everything changed. My family, they died in the conflict. I was just a child when it all happened. Afterward, there was no one to protect me. I ended up alone, drifting from one colony to another." She paused, as if reliving the pain of those years. Ben's heart ached for her, but he didn't know what to say. He had no words for this kind of loss. "I didn't have anywhere to go," Lyra continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to survive, to find something, but I couldn't. The only way I could get food was to sell myself. It was the only choice I had." Ben felt a wave of anger and sadness rise within him. He had seen people like Lyra before, people who were pushed to the edge and left to survive however they could. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. He couldn't imagine what it had been like for her to make such a choice. "You never deserved that," Ben said firmly, his voice steady. "You're better than that. You're worth more than just surviving." Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment she seemed to study him, as if unsure of whether to believe him. "You're the first person who's ever said that to me," she said softly. Ben didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her go back to that life. He didn't know why he felt so strongly about it, but he did. He had a feeling that something in her, something deep down, was worth saving, and somehow he knew that he had to be the one to help her find it. Ben and Lyra had spent the last few weeks settling into their new life in the rundown colony. The days were long, and the nights felt colder than they ever had before. Despite the quiet, there was a new sense of purpose in Ben's life. He was no longer just a traveler passing through. He was now someone's protector, even if Lyra hadn't asked for it. They'd been through a lot together already, but Ben could see that Lyra was still far from being the person she used to be. Before the war, before the hunger, before the loneliness. She was broken in many ways, though she was doing her best to hide it. Ben could see it in the way she avoided people, the way she flinched when someone got too close. But there were good moments, too. Ben had seen the way her eyes would light, up when he managed to bring them a decent meal, or when he made her laugh at something silly. The first time she smiled at him in a way that reached her eyes, Ben knew he was doing the right thing by staying. He couldn't help but care for her, in a way that was beyond just wanting to help her survive. There was something in her that pulled him in, something that made him want to be there for her no matter what. One evening, after a long day of trying to sell some scrap metal they'd found in the junkyard, Ben and Lyra sat on the edge of their small room, the dim light from a nearby street lamp casting shadows against the walls. They hadn't had much luck that day, and Ben could see that Lyra was starting to lose hope again. She hadn't said much on the way back, but he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "You okay?" Ben asked, his voice gentle. Lyra didn't answer. Right away, she just stared out the small window at the starry sky. The only sound in the room was the distant hum of the colony, the buzz of machines, and the occasional footstep from the street below. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice quiet. "I just keep thinking about my family. What could have been if the war never happened, if everything didn't fall apart?" Ben sat beside her, his heart aching at her words. He knew she was thinking about all the things she had lost, the people she would never see again. He could only imagine what it must be like to lose everything in the blink of an eye, to have your entire world turned upside down. "I don't know what that's like," Ben said softly, "but I know that you don't have to go through it alone anymore. We'll figure it out. You're not alone now." Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, just as Ben was starting to wonder if he had said the wrong thing, Lyra finally broke the silence. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know why you're helping me, but I don't think I could have made it without you." Ben didn't know how to respond. It wasn't about thanks. He wasn't doing this for praise. He was doing it because he couldn't just walk away from someone who needed help. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing her voice tremble with emotion, made him realize just how much his simple actions had meant to her. "I'm not going anywhere," Ben said with a smile, though it wasn't as confident as he wanted it to be. He didn't know how long they could keep living like this, in a place where survival was the only rule. But he would try. For Lyra. They sat in silence for a while longer, just listening to the sounds of the colony outside. As the night grew darker, a sudden idea came to Ben. "Lyra," he began, his voice a little hesitant. "What if we left? What if we went somewhere else? Somewhere safer? Maybe we could find a place where we can start fresh." Lyra turned to look at him, her eyes wide in surprise. "Leave?" she asked, her voice soft. "You mean leave here? But where would we go?" "I don't know," Ben admitted. "But there has to be a place out there where we can make a new start, a place where you don't have to hide anymore, where you don't have to worry about people hurting you." For the first time, Lyra looked hopeful. Her eyes sparkled a little as she thought about it. Do you really think we could find a place like that?" Ben didn't have the answer. He wasn't sure, but he wanted to believe that they could. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll try. Together." The idea of leaving the colony and heading into the unknown was a little scary, but for the first time, it felt like there was a chance for something better. Lyra's shoulders relaxed as she exhaled deeply, as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. "I think I'd like that," she said quietly. Ben smiled, glad to see the hope returning to her eyes. Then it settled. "We'll leave tomorrow." The plan was simple, but it gave them both something to look forward to. Lyra didn't know where they would go, but she trusted Ben. She had never trusted anyone like this before. She had always had to fight for everything, but Ben's quiet strength gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The next morning, they packed what little they had left. Ben made sure to keep their journey quiet, avoiding attention as much as possible. Lyra had spent so much of her life being hunted and hiding from people who wanted to harm her. She didn't want to attract attention now, especially with the threat of bounty hunters still hanging over her head. They left the small room, walking out into the bright sunlight. Ben felt the weight of the decision, but at the same time, it felt like the right thing to do. Lyra, though uncertain of what lay ahead, walked beside him with a quiet determination. They headed to the spaceport, where ships came and went every day. Ben had enough credits to get them on a transport ship that would take them to a neighboring planet. It wasn't far, but it was a new start, and that's all they needed right now. As they stood in line at the boarding station, Lyra looked up at Ben, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly. Ben looked down at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I've always believed in you, Lyra. You just didn't know it yet." And with that, they boarded the transport ship, leaving behind the broken colony and stepping into the unknown. The days following their decision to leave the colony passed with a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. Ben and Lyra traveled together, staying on a small transport ship that took them to a neighboring planet. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough for now. Ben kept his head down as much as possible, wary of any eyes that might be watching them. Lyra, though, was more relaxed. She seemed to feel a little more at ease as the days passed. There were no bounty hunters here, no people from her past. Just two travelers trying to make a new life. The planet they arrived on was called Irelia, a world much bigger than the colony they'd left behind. The city was full of life, bustling with traders, travelers, and workers from all over the galaxy. It felt like a fresh start. The air was cleaner, and the streets were lined with tall buildings instead of the broken-down shacks of their former home. Ben knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long, but he thought it might be a good idea to rest for a while. They found a small apartment in the city, a simple room with just enough space for both of them. It wasn't much, but it felt like a luxury compared to what they had left behind. Lyra seemed to be settling in. She spent her days walking around the city, familiarizing herself with the surroundings. Ben spent most of his time trying to find work, taking on odd jobs whenever he could. He wasn't picky, he just wanted to make enough to keep them going. It was during one of these jobs that things began to change. Ben had taken a job working on a nearby dock, fixing a ship's engine. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. As he worked, he heard a familiar voice calling out to him. "Ben." He looked up and saw Rex, an old acquaintance from the colony, walking toward him. Rex was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough face and a bad reputation. Ben had known him from before. Rex had always been the type of guy who made his money through shady deals. Ben had always kept his distance, but now, seeing Rex again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. "What are you doing here?" Ben asked, wiping his hands on his shirt. "I was looking for you," Rex said with a grin. "You've been keeping quiet, haven't you? You and the little alien girl. Word's been spreading. You two have been causing a bit of a stir." Ben stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Rex's grin widened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Oh, don't act so innocent. I know exactly who you're with. I know what she's been through, and I know where she's been hiding. You really think you can just disappear like that?" Ben's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Lyra's past sent a cold shiver down his spine. He knew she had been running from someone, but he didn't realize how far her past had followed her. Rex's words confirmed what Ben had been trying to ignore. They weren't safe here. "What do you want?" Ben demanded. "I just wanted to remind you," Rex said, stepping back and shrugging. "People like you and her don't just get to hide forever. You'll always be looking over your shoulder. And when the bounty hunters find her, you'll be the one caught in the crossfire." Ben's mind raced. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't thought the danger would follow them so quickly. Rex was right. Lyra's past was never going to let them go. She would always be a target for someone, somewhere. "Stay away from her," Ben warned, his voice low. Rex chuckled. "I'm just giving you a heads up, Ben. The galaxy doesn't forget people like her, and it sure doesn't forget people who try to protect them." Before Ben could respond, Rex turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Ben stood there staring after him, his thoughts swirling. He knew Rex wasn't lying. He knew that whatever they had just started to build, it was in danger of falling apart. Later that evening, as the sun set over the bustling city, Ben returned to the apartment. He found Lyra sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline. She looked calm, peaceful even, but Ben could see the shadow of worry in her eyes. She had been quiet lately, more so than usual. Ben knew she was still carrying the weight of her past, and now he was afraid it was catching up with them. Lyra turned when she heard the door open, offering him a small smile. But Ben could see that she knew something was wrong. "What's the matter?" she asked softly. Ben hesitated, not wanting to tell her the truth. He didn't want to worry her, but he knew she deserved to know. "Rex found me today," Ben said, his voice tight. "He said people are looking for you." Lyra's face went pale. Her eyes widened in shock, then quickly filled with fear. "The bounty hunters?" she whispered. Ben nodded. "They're not far behind. We've got to leave." "I knew it," she muttered to herself. "I knew it wouldn't be this easy. I can't keep running forever." Ben walked over to her, kneeling down beside her. "We can keep running, Lyra. We just need to get ahead of them." "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been running my whole life. I just wanted to stop, to finally feel safe." Her hands gripped the edge of the chair. "But every time I think I can rest, something drags me back." Ben felt his heart break for her. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make her feel safe. He just wanted to protect her, to keep her from going through any more pain. But the reality was clear now. Their pasts had caught up with them, and there was no easy way out. "We'll figure it out," Ben said firmly. "I won't let anyone take you from me." Lyra looked at him, and for the first time in days there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "How do you always know what to say?" Ben smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I don't, but I know we can make it through this, together." They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them lost in their thoughts. But the truth was clear. They were no longer just running away. They were fighting for a future, for the chance to finally be free. And no matter how dangerous it became, Ben knew he would keep fighting for Lyra. The days after Ben and Lyra had learned that danger was closing in on them were some of the hardest they had ever faced. The weight of their situation hung over them, thick and heavy. Lyra, always strong, had her moments of doubt. The fear in her eyes was impossible to miss whenever she glanced over her shoulder, knowing that the bounty hunters were never far behind. She had spent so many years running, fighting to survive, that the thought of truly settling down seemed like a dream she could never reach. Ben, on the other hand, felt the pressure of keeping Lyra safe more than ever. He had promised her that. He wouldn't let anyone take her, but he didn't know how far that promise would stretch. The world around them felt dangerous, full of shadows, and every time they thought they were a step ahead, it seemed like they were pulled right back into danger. But Ben refused to give up. He spent his days trying to find a way to get them out of Irelia, to get them to somewhere safe where no one could find them. He had no plan, no map to guide them, but the determination in his heart kept him moving forward. He couldn't let Lyra live the rest of her life in fear. She deserved more than that. She deserved peace. One morning, after yet another sleepless night spent planning their next move, Ben sat at the small kitchen table. He stared down at a map he had drawn, tracing the path of planets and star systems. The possibilities felt endless, but the risks were always the same. "Ben?" Lyra's soft voice broke through his thoughts. Ben looked up, and for a moment, the weight of everything they were facing settled on him. But then, Lyra stepped into the room, her eyes focused, quiet resolve in her posture. "Are we really leaving?" she asked. Ben stood up slowly, taking a deep breath. "I think we have to. We can't stay here forever, Lyra. If we don't leave now, the hunters will find us. And I won't let them hurt you." Lyra bit her lip, as if considering his words. Then she nodded slowly, her gaze meeting his. "Where will we go?" "I've been looking into it," Ben said, his voice steady. "There's a planet called Torella. It's far out in the outer rim. There are no big cities, no big corporations looking for people like us. It's a quiet place. Lyra's expression softened. You think we could be safe there? Ben smiled faintly. It's the best shot we've got. Then we go, Lyra said, a hint of determination in her voice. And just like that, the decision was made. They would leave Iralia and travel to Torella no matter what it took. There would be no more running, no more hiding. It was time for them to take control of their future. The next few days were filled with preparation. Ben sold what little they had left, just a few old tools, some spare parts from his previous jobs, to get enough credits for passage to the outer rim. Lyra, despite her anxiety, tried to help by learning about the ship they would take. She knew nothing about piloting, but Ben was patient, teaching her what he could. It was a small step, but it made her feel like she wasn't completely helpless. On the day they left, Ben felt the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just leaving a colony behind, they were leaving their pasts. And even though he couldn't deny the fear in his chest, he also felt something else. Hope. The kind of hope that had been missing for so long. They boarded the transport ship in the early hours of the morning, when the streets were quiet. There were no fanfare or cheers, just two people trying to escape a life they never wanted. As they stepped onto the ship, Ben felt a strange sense of relief, as if they were stepping into a new world. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The ship wasn't much. It was a small transport, a few seats and narrow hallways. The inside smelled faintly of metal and old engines. It wasn't the kind of ship that would impress anyone, but to Ben and Lyra, it was a symbol of freedom. The pilot was a quiet man, who barely spoke to them, but that was fine. They didn't need small talk. They just needed to get out. As the ship lifted off and left the atmosphere of Iralia behind, Ben couldn't help but glance at Lyra. She was standing by the window, her face pressed against the cool glass, watching the planet shrink in the distance. For the first time in a long time, she looked peaceful. The lines of worry had softened on her face, and there was a small spark of something in her eyes that Ben hadn't seen before. It was a flicker of hope, of possibility. "We're really doing this," Lyra whispered, almost to herself. Ben stepped beside her, his hand brushing lightly against hers. "Yeah, we are." The next few days on the ship were quiet. Lyra spent most of her time by the window, looking out into the vastness of space, while Ben tried to get a sense of their surroundings. There was a calmness to it all, a sense that for once they didn't have to look over their shoulders every second. But the calm didn't last long. One evening, as they approached the outer rim, the ship's communication system beeped loudly. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. "We've got a problem! Looks like there's a pirate ship ahead, and they're intercepting us." Ben's heart sank. He knew this was coming. The outer rim wasn't known for its safety, and there were always risks. Lyra turned to him, her face pale. "Pirates?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ben nodded. "Stay close to me." The ship jerked suddenly and the lights flickered. The pilot's voice came through again, this time with more urgency. "They're demanding we stop. We need to pay a fee to pass through their sector. If we don't, they'll force us down." Ben clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let anyone stop them. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. "We can't pay them," Ben said, his voice hard. "But we're not going down without a fight." Lyra's eyes widened, and she stepped closer to him. "What do we do?" Ben took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We can't let them board us. We need to make it to Torella before they catch up." He knew it was a gamble, but there was no other choice. The pilot was already adjusting the ship's speed, trying to outmaneuver the pirates, but Ben knew they couldn't outrun them for long. They needed to make their move. "You stay behind me," Ben said firmly. "I'll keep you safe." As the tension grew, Ben couldn't help but think of everything they had been through. everything they had risked to get here. He couldn't. Let this be the end, not now. Not when they had finally found something to fight for.